She thought marriage meant safety. Instead, it became her prison. When Grace Hartford refused to sign away her unborn baby, her husband and his mistress cornered her in the kitchen. Two pairs of scissors. One pregnant woman. No way out. The blades were inches from her throat when the door burst open. What happened next would destroy a billionaire's empire, expose a conspiracy, and prove that sometimes the people who save us are connected to us in ways we never imagined. This is the story of how silence almost killed her, and how speaking up changed everything. If you believe survivors deserve justice, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us what you'd do in her situation. Let's begin. The kitchen knife clattered against the marble countertop, and Grace Hartford froze. Not because of the knife, because of the scissors. Two pairs, chrome handles gleaming under the recessed lighting of the Pacific Palisades showcase home. Derek Manning held one pair loosely at his side, his jaw set in that expression she'd learned to fear. Becca Sullivan clutched the other, her manicured fingers opening and closing the blades with a soft, rhythmic click that made Grace's skin crawl. Sign the papers. Grace. Derek's voice was flat, empty of the charm that had won her over 3 years ago. We're done playing games. Grace pressed her back against the refrigerator, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. 5 months pregnant, she felt the baby kick, as if sensing her terror. This is insane, she whispered. You can't. Becca laughed at also a sharp sound like breaking glass. Honey, we already have. Your best friend thinks you're unstable. Your lawyer knows you illegally recorded conversations. The judge has you trapped in California. You've got nothing. The scissors clicked again. Click, click, click. Derek took a step forward. The house is mine. The money is mine. And after you sign these papers, the baby will be mine too. You'll walk away with whatever dignity you have left, or we'll make sure you have none at all. Grace's throat tightened. How had it come to this 48 hours ago? She'd still believed there was a way out, that someone would help her, that the system would protect her. She'd been wrong about everything. I'm not signing. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. That's my baby. Our baby. Derek's expression darkened. He moved closer, raising the scissors. The pointed tips caught the light. Then you're making this harder than it needs to be. Becca circled around the kitchen island, blocking the doorway. We tried being nice, Grace. We really did. But you just won't listen. The scissors were 3 feet away now. 2 feet. Grace's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. She thought of her parents, Frank and Ruth, back in their small house in Riverside. They'd warned her about Derek. Her father had looked him in the eye at the wedding and said, "Something's not right about that man." She should have listened. Derek lunged forward. The scissors flashed. Grace threw her arm up instinctively, and the blade caught her forearm, leaving a thin red line that immediately welled with blood. "Stop," she screamed. "Please, I'm pregnant." "That's the problem," Becca hissed, moving in from the other side. "You're an anchor around his neck. The baby's just leverage. Once it's born, you're gone." Grace felt the refrigerator handle digging into her spine. There was nowhere left to go. Derek raised the scissors again, this time toward her throat. She closed her eyes. The front door slammed open with a bang that shook the walls. Heavy footsteps echoed across the hardwood floors, moving fast. Grace's eyes flew open to see a tall man in a charcoal suit burst into the kitchen, his face twisted with fury. James Cordell, Derek's boss. The billionaire CEO of Cordell Development Group. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was thunder. Derek spun around, the scissors still in his hand. For a moment, the three of them formed a frozen tableau. Then Derek's practiced smile slid into place, though his hand trembled slightly. "James, this isn't what it looks like." James's eyes moved from Derek to Becca to Grace, taking in the blood on her arm, the tears on her face, the scissors in their hands. His jaw clenched. "Get away from her. Now." "She attacked us," Becca said quickly. "We were defending ourselves." James pulled out his phone, his eyes never leaving Derek. "I'm calling 911 and my lawyer." "Don't move." That's when Grace's legs finally gave out. She slid down the refrigerator to the cold tile floor, her hand pressed against her stomach. feeling the baby kick frantically inside her. This was supposed to be the moment she died. Instead, somehow, impossibly, someone had arrived in time. But as she watched Derek's face transform from shock to calculation, Grace realized something that made her blood run colder than the scissors had. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The therapist's office smelled like lavender and lies. Grace sat on the gray couch, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the abstract painting on the wall. Dr. Morrison waited patiently, her pen poised over her notepad. "How are things at home?" "Grace, fine." The words sat on her tongue, ready to escape like it always did. But something in her chest felt too tight this time, too heavy to carry alone anymore. "Derek is having an affair," Grace heard herself say. The words hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Morrison's expression didn't change. "How long have you known? 6 months? Maybe longer." Grace's voice was flat. "Her name is Becca Sullivan. She works in his marketing department. They don't even try to hide it anymore." "Have you confronted him?" Grace laughed, a bitter sound. 3 times. The first time, he said I was imagining things. The second time, he said I was hormonal because of the pregnancy. The third time, he told me if I brought it up again, he'd make sure I regretted it. She looked down at her hands. Her wedding ring felt like it was burning her finger. "Yesterday, I found confirmation for a trip to Napa. 2 tickets, 2 hotel rooms booked as a suite. This weekend." Grace's voice cracked. "I thought maybe he was planning to surprise me, to fix things. Then I saw Becca's name on the second ticket." Dr. Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Grace, that must have been devastating." "What's devastating is that I'm still pretending not to know." The words came faster now, pushed by pressure that had been building for months. "What's devastating is that I smile when he comes home late, smelling like her perfume. That I cook his dinner and iron his shirts and act like everything is fine because I don't know what else to do." "Why don't you leave?" The question should have been simple. It wasn't, "Where would I go?" Grace's hand moved to her stomach. "I quit my job at the hotel when we got married. He handles all the money by Falno. My parents live in a 2-bedroom house in Riverside. They're barely making ends meet after my dad lost his job. I can't burden them with this. With me. What about friends?" Grace thought of Nora Price, her best friend since college. They hadn't spoken in weeks. Every time Grace had tried to reach out, Nora's texts had been short, distracted. Last week, she'd finally called back. "I'm seeing someone," Nora had said, her voice bright with excitement. "It's new, but I think it's serious. We'll all have to get together soon." Grace had agreed, relief flooding through her. Finally, someone to talk to, someone who would understand. She'd texted Nora this morning, "Can we meet for coffee? I really need to talk." Nora had responded an hour later. "Today's tough. Maybe next week." But then, miraculously, another text. "Actually, let's do today. 3 o'clock at Bluestone Cafe." Grace looked at Dr. Morrison. "My friend Nora finally agreed to meet me today. After weeks of avoiding me, I'm going to tell her everything." "That's good, Grace. Having support is crucial." But as Grace left the therapist's office, walking toward her car in the parking garage, something felt wrong. She couldn't name it, just a feeling in her gut, like standing on ice and hearing it crack beneath her feet. She drove to Bluestone Cafe anyway. Nora was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked different. New highlights in her hair, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, a glow that came from either happiness or expensive skincare. "Grace," Nora stood, hugging her briefly. "You look tired." Grace slid into the chair across from her. "I haven't been sleeping well. Pregnancy will do that." Nora's smile was bright, but her eyes kept darting to her phone. For the next 20 minutes, Grace tried to tell her story. Derek's affair, the isolation, the fear, the way he'd started controlling every aspect of her life, from the money to her phone contacts to where she could go. Nora listened, nodding occasionally, but something was off. Her responses were too quick, too practiced. "Have you thought about couples therapy?" Nora asked. "He won't go. Maybe you're being too hard on him. Men get scared when babies are coming. They act out." Grace stared at her friend. "He's having an affair." "Nora, With a woman from his office? He takes her on romantic trips while I'm home alone and pregnant. But you don't have proof, right? Just suspicions. The words hit Grace like a slap. I found the hotel reservation. That could be explained. Business trip. Maybe. Grace felt something crack inside her chest. Whose side are you on? Nora's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and for just a second, Grace saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. I'm on your side, Nora said, but she was already gathering her purse. Look, I have to run. But Grace, my advice, don't make this bigger than it is. Marriage is hard. Having a baby is hard. Just try to make it work. Okay, she was gone before Grace could respond. Grace sat alone at the table, her untouched latte going cold. The crack in her chest widened into a chasm. Even her best friend didn't believe her, or worse, didn't care. She drove home in a daze. The showcase house in Pacific Palisades looked beautiful from the outside. White stone, floor-to-ceiling windows, a fountain in the circular driveway. Derek had bought it 2 years ago, after a major deal closed. This is where we'll raise our family, he'd said, kissing her forehead. Now it felt like a mausoleum. Grace parked in the garage and walked through the side door. Voices drifted from the living room. Derek's laugh, low and familiar. Another laugh, high and sharp. She stopped in the hallway. Through the archway, she could see them. Derek on the couch, Becca perched on the armrest, her hand on his shoulder. And sitting in the chair across from them, wine glass in hand, was Nora Price. All three of them laughing together. Grace's world tilted sideways. Nora saw her first. The laughter died on her lips. Grace, hi. Derek turned, his expression morphing from surprise to irritation. You're home early. What is this? Grace's voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else's body. Becca smiled, slow and satisfied. We were just talking about you. Actually, Nora. Grace looked at her friend, pleading. What's going on? Nora had the grace to look uncomfortable. She set down her wine glass. Grace, I'm dating Ryan, Derek's business partner. We've been seeing each other for a few months now. The floor seemed to drop away beneath Grace's feet. You called him, she whispered. After coffee, you told him everything I said. I told my boyfriend that his partner's wife was making some serious accusations. Nora said, her voice defensive. That's what anyone would do. Derek stood, crossing his arms. You've been going around telling people I'm abusive, Grace, that I'm controlling, that I'm having an affair. Do you know what that could do to my reputation? To my business? It's true, Tissot, Grace said, but her voice was weak. You're paranoid. Derek's voice was hard now, all pretense of civility gone. You're hormonal and irrational. And frankly, I'm starting to worry about what kind of mother you're going to be. The words hit like physical blows. Becca stood, smoothing her skirt. We think you should take some time away. Grace, get your head straight. Maybe stay with your parents for a while. This is my house, Grace said. Actually, Derek pulled folded papers from his jacket pocket. It's my house, my name on the deed, my money that paid for it, and these are separation papers. I'm filing for custody after the baby is born. My lawyer thinks we have a strong case, given your mental state. Grace looked at Nora, desperate. You know me. You know I'm not crazy. Nora picked up her purse, avoiding Grace's eyes. I think Derek's right. You need help. Grace, professional help. This pregnancy has really done a number on you. Get out, Grace's voice broke. All of you, get out. This is my house, Derek reminded her, his voice cold. You get out. Grace grabbed her car keys and ran. She made it to her car before the tears came. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. She drove aimlessly for an hour, then 2, until she found herself in a Target parking lot, staring at her phone. She had $300 in her personal account. Everything else was controlled by Derek. Her parents' house was too small. She had no job, no income, no friends she could trust, and she was 5 months pregnant. Grace called the only place she could think of, a legal aid clinic she'd found online. Riverside County Legal Services. How can I help you? I need help, Grace said. My husband is having an affair and he's trying to take my baby. The legal aid's office smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Grace sat in a plastic chair, her intake form trembling in her hands. The attorney assigned to her case looked about 12 years old, with wire-rimmed glasses and a coffee stain on her collar. I'm Jennifer Wells, the young woman said, scanning Grace's form. You're seeking separation and temporary custody protection. Yes. Grace's voice was hoarse from crying. My husband is having an affair. He wants to take my baby after it's born. He said he's filing for full custody. Jennifer typed notes into her computer. Has he been physically abusive? Not exactly, but yesterday he said, has he hit you, pushed you, physically restrained you? No, but threatened you with violence. Grace thought about the coldness in Derek's eyes, the way he'd backed her into corners during arguments, the time he'd grabbed her phone and thrown it against the wall. He scares me. Jennifer's expression softened. I understand, but fear isn't evidence. We need concrete incidents for a restraining order. What we can do is file for legal separation and request temporary custody arrangements. How long does that take? 4 to 6 weeks for the first hearing. Grace's hand moved to her stomach. I'll be almost 7 months pregnant by then. I know it's not ideal. Jennifer printed several documents. In the meantime, I need you to document everything. Keep a journal. Save text messages. If he threatens you, record it. Record it on your phone, video or audio. We need evidence that you're being threatened or abused. A spark of hope flickered in Grace's chest. I can do that. Good. File these papers at the courthouse today. We'll schedule a hearing as soon as possible. Grace left the office feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She had a plan. She had a lawyer. She was fighting back. That afternoon, she phoned the separation papers. The clerk stamped them with a satisfying thunk that felt like victory. Derek was served the next morning. He called her immediately, his voice tight with rage. You're making a huge mistake. Grace, I'm protecting myself and my baby. You think you can win against me? I have money. I have lawyers. I have witnesses who will say you're unstable. Then I guess we'll see what a judge thinks. She hung up, her heart pounding. For the first time in months, she felt powerful. That night, Derek came home late. Grace heard him moving around downstairs. She grabbed her phone, opened the recording app, and crept to the top of the stairs. Can't believe she actually saw him, Derek was saying. His voice drifted up from the kitchen. Stupid bitch thinks she can take me on. What are you going to do? Becca's voice. Destroy her. She has nothing, no money, no job, no witnesses. My lawyers will make her look insane. What about the baby? The baby's mine. I'll get full custody. She'll get supervised visitation at best. Maybe nothing if we play this right. Grace's hands shook as she held the phone, recording every word. This was it. This was the evidence she needed. The next morning, she met Jennifer at a coffee shop and played her the recording. Jennifer's face went pale. Grace, where did you record this? At my house, on the stairs. Were you part of the conversation? No, I was listening from a Grace. Jennifer set down her coffee cup carefully. California is a two-party consent state. You can't record conversations you're not part of without permission. This recording is illegal. The hope drained out of Grace's body like water from a punctured bucket. What? Not only is it inadmissible in court, but you could be charged with a felony. Illegal wiretapping carries up to 3 years in prison. But he was threatening me, planning to take my baby. I know, I believe you, but this recording can't help you. And if Derek finds out about it, it will hurt you. Jennifer looked genuinely sorry. You need to delete it. Now. Grace's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. We know what you did. Delete the recording or we'll press charges. Her blood ran cold. How did they check your phone for tracking apps, spyware, anything? Grace scrolled through her apps with shaking hands. An app she didn't recognize. Remote family tracker. He's been monitoring your phone, Jennifer said quietly. Everything you do, everywhere you go. He heard that recording the moment you made it. Grace deleted the recording, but it was too late. Derek's lawyers filed a motion within hours, painting her as unhinged and criminal. They included the wiretapping attempt as evidence of her deteriorating mental state and disregard for the law. The judge granted a temporary order. Grace couldn't leave California. She couldn't take the baby out of the country after birth. She had to attend mandatory psychological evaluation before any custody hearing. Grace sat in her car outside the courthouse, staring at the order. Every door she tried to open slammed shut in her face. Every move she made backfired. Her phone buzzed. "Derek, come home. We need to talk." She drove back to Pacific Palisades in a fog. Derek was waiting in the living room, his expression calm, almost kind. "Grace, sit down." She remained standing. "This has gotten out of hand," he said. "The lawyers, the court filings, the drama. It's not good for you or the baby. You're having an affair. I made mistakes. I'm willing to work on things." He stood, moving closer. "But you need to drop the separation. Delete all this legal nonsense. We'll go to couples therapy. Make it work. And if I don't," his expression hardened, "then my lawyers will make sure everyone knows you're an unstable woman who illegally recorded her husband, who makes false accusations, whose own best friend thinks she's delusional. They'll paint you as unfit, and they'll win." Grace felt the walls closing in, every escape route blocked, every ally turned enemy. "I need time to think," she whispered. "You have 24 hours. Derek walked past her toward the stairs. "After that, I'll make the decision for you." That night, Grace barely slept. She lay in bed, feeling the baby move inside her burrow, and tried to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so fast. At 2 in the morning, her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "I can help you. I have evidence against Derek Manning. Meet me tomorrow. 3 p.m. parking garage at Westfield Mall. Level 4. Come alone. Don't tell anyone." Grace stared at the message. It could be a trap. It could be Derek, testing her. But attached to the message was a photo. Derek and Becca, clearly intimate, standing outside a bank with manila envelopes. The timestamp was from 6 months ago. "Who is this?" Grace typed. "Former employee. He destroyed me too. Now it's time for payback." Grace looked at the photo again. It was real, dated, concrete evidence of the affair. For the first time in days, hope flickered again. She texted back, "I'll be there." The Westfield Mall parking garage at 3 in the afternoon was nearly empty. Grace's footsteps echoed as she climbed the concrete stairs to level 4. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was stupid, dangerous. Everything in her gut screamed that something was wrong. But the photo had been real. And she was drowning. When you're drowning, you grab at anything. Level 4 was deserted except for a few scattered cars. Grace walked slowly between the rows, her phone clutched in her hand. A figure emerged from behind a concrete pillar. Male, average height, baseball cap pulled low. "Grace Hartford." His voice was muffled. "That's me. You said you had evidence." He moved closer. Too close. Grace took a step back. "I need to know I can trust you first," he said. "Derek Manning ruined my career, stole my work, got me blacklisted. I want him to pay." "I just want my baby safe," Grace said. "If you have evidence of the affair, I can use it in court." "The affair's nothing. He's been embezzling. Cooking books. I have copies of everything now." Grace's breath caught. If Derek was embezzling, that changed everything. That was criminal. That was real power. "Can I see the documents?" The man reached into his jacket. Grace tensed, but he pulled out a manila envelope. Started to hand it to her. Then headlights flooded the parking level. A black Mercedes screeched to a stop 30 feet away. Doors flew open. Derek and Becca emerged, and behind them, a man with a professional camera. Grace's stomach dropped. The man in the baseball cap was already running, disappearing down the stairwell. "Perfect," Derek said loudly, his voice echoing. "Did you get the shots?" The photographer nodded, clicking through images on his camera. Becca walked toward Grace, her heels clicking on concrete. "Meeting strange men in parking garages." "Grace, while you're pregnant, that's going to look great in court." "What is this?" But Grace already knew. Her mouth tasted like copper. "This," Derek said, "is you being caught meeting with someone for money, Look at the photos. You reaching for that envelope? Looks like a drug deal, doesn't it? Or maybe you're selling information about my company. Either way, the judge will love it. Grace's legs felt weak. The text, the photo, that was you. We needed one more thing for the custody file. Derek pocketed his phone. Your lawyer thinks you're the victim. Wait until she sees these pictures. Wait until she hears about you sneaking out for secret meetings with strange men. This is entrapment. This is you being stupid. Becca smiled. Again. The photographer was already leaving, his evidence secured. Grace turned and ran. She made it to her car, locked the doors, and sat there shaking. Every move she made tightened the noose. Every attempt to fight back gave them more ammunition. She drove home on autopilot, her mind blank with shock. The house was dark when she arrived. She went straight to the kitchen, needing water, needing to think, needing to figure out what to do next. Derek and Becca arrived 20 minutes later. Grace heard the front door open, heard their voices, low and satisfied. She stood at the kitchen sink, her back to them, trying to control her breathing. Sign the papers, Grace. Derek's voice right behind her. She turned. They were both there, blocking the doorway. What papers? Derek tossed a folder onto the kitchen island. Custody agreement. You sign over all parental rights. In exchange, we don't press charges for the wiretapping. We don't show the judge those photos from today. You walk away clean. That's my baby. That baby is your only bargaining chip. And we're offering you a deal. Take it. No. The word hung in the air. Derek's jaw tightened. Becca moved to the knife block on the counter. For a second, Grace thought she was reaching for a knife. Instead, she pulled out a pair of kitchen scissors. Long, sharp, chrome handles gleaming. Let me explain something to you, Becca said, opening and closing the scissors. Click, click, click. You have no power here, no money, no chewipillo, no friends, no evidence we can't explain away or discredit. You're nobody. Grace, a pregnant nobody who's about to lose everything. Well, Derek walked to the drawer, pulled out another pair of scissors. We tried being nice, we tried being reasonable, but you just won't listen. Grace backed toward the refrigerator, her heart pounding. This is insane. You can't, Derek laughed. Grace, we already have. Your own best friend thinks you're crazy. The legal system is on our side. Your illegal recording proved you're unstable. Those photos today proved you're dangerous. Who's going to believe you? The scissors clicked. Both of them now. A terrible rhythm. Grace's back hit the refrigerator. Please, I'm pregnant. You're a baby. That's the problem, Becca said. You're an anchor. The baby's leverage. Once it's born, you're useless. Derek moved closer. Last chance. Sign the papers. Grace's hand shook as it moved to her stomach. The baby kicked. Hard. She thought of her father's words at the wedding. Something's not right about that man. She should have listened. But it was too late now. I'm not signing, she whispered. Derek's expression went cold. He raised the scissors, moving toward her throat. Then you're making this harder than it needs to be. We'll make it look like an accident, Becca said, circling around. Pregnant woman, home alone, fell on scissors while cutting something. Tragic. But these things happen. Grace tried to bolt for the doorway. Becca blocked her. Scissors raised. They backed her into the corner where the refrigerator met the marble island. Trapped. No escape. Derek lunged forward. Grace threw her arm up. The scissors caught her forearm, slicing through skin. Blood welled immediately, hot and bright. She screamed. Derek grabbed her shoulder, forcing her against the refrigerator. The scissors moved toward her throat. She could see her reflection in the blades. Nobody's coming to save you, he hissed. Nobody cares. The tip of the scissors touched her throat. A sharp sting. She felt blood trickle down her neck. Grace closed her eyes, thought of her parents, thought of her unborn child, thought of all the moments she'd never have. The front door slammed open. Heavy footsteps thundered across the floor. What the hell is going on here? The voice was deep, furious, commanding. Grace's eyes flew open. Derek spun around, scissors still in his hand. Standing into the kitchen doorway was James Cordell. 6'3", broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit and an expression of absolute rage. Derek's face went white. James, this isn't... Get away from her. James's voice cut like a blade. Now. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Then James pulled out his phone. I'm calling 911 and my lawyer. Don't move a muscle. Becca dropped her scissors. They clattered on the tile. Derek still held his, but his hand was shaking. She attacked us. We were defending ourselves. I saw everything through the window before I came in. James's eyes were cold. You're done, Manning. Grace's legs gave out. She slid down the refrigerator to the floor. Her hand pressed against the cut on her throat. Blood seeped between her fingers. James was already talking to the police. I need officers at 42 Ocean View Drive immediately. Assault in progress. Pregnant woman injured. 2 suspects on scene. Grace heard sirens in the distance. Growing louder. She looked up at James Cordell, this man she'd never met, and whispered, Why are you here? He met her eyes. I came to fire your husband. Turns out I arrived just in time. Derek's face crumbled. James, please. We can talk about this. The only talking you're doing is to the police. James crouched down next to Grace, his voice gentler. You're safe now. I promise they can't hurt you anymore. Grace pressed her hand harder against her bleeding throat and started to cry. Not from pain, from relief, from the impossible reality that someone had finally believed her. The siren screamed closer. And for the first time in months, Grace Hartford let herself hope. The emergency room was too bright and too loud. Grace sat on a paper-covered exam table while a nurse cleaned the cut on her throat. It wasn't deep, but it would scar. You're lucky, the nurse said. Another inch and it would have hit the carotid. Lucky. Grace almost laughed. Through the curtain, she could hear voices, police officers taking statements. James Cordell's deep baritone, calm and authoritative. Derek's voice, higher-pitched, defensive. A female officer pushed through the curtain. Mrs. Manning, I'm Officer Collins. I need to ask you some questions. Grace told her everything. The affair, the isolation, the legal threats, the setup at the parking garage, the scissors, the blood, all of it. Officer Collins wrote it all down, her expression neutral. Your husband claims you attacked them first, that they were defending themselves. Grace's heart sank. That's not true. I believe you. We have a witness who says otherwise. The officer nodded toward the hallway. Mr. Cordell saw the whole thing through the kitchen window before he entered. His statement contradicts your husband's completely. Relief flooded through Grace like warm water. Your husband and Ms. Sullivan have been arrested. Officer Collins continued. Assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy, endangerment of a pregnant woman. They're being processed now. They'll likely post bail tomorrow, but there will be a restraining order in place. What about my baby, the custody case? That's a civil matter, but this criminal case will certainly impact it. The officer handed Grace a card. Victim services will contact you tomorrow. In the meantime, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Grace thought of her parents' small house, of returning there in shame, pregnant and bleeding, having ignored all their warnings. I'll figure something out. She's staying with me. Grace looked up. James Cordell stood at the curtain opening, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his tie loosened. I have a guest house on my property, he said. Fully furnished, private, secure. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. I can't, Grace started. Yes, you can. His voice was firm but kind. You need somewhere safe. I'm offering. No strings. Officer Collins nodded approvingly. That's a good option. Mrs. Manning, we'll need to know where to reach you. An hour later, Grace found herself in the passenger seat of James Cordell's Mercedes, driving through the dark streets of Los Angeles. She wore hospital scrubs because her clothes were evidence now, bagged and tagged. Why are you helping me? She asked finally. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, what's your father's name? Frank Hartford. Baum. 20 years ago. I was 23 years old, working construction, trying to save money to start my own company. I was on a crew building a shopping center in Riverside. Grace turned to look at him. The site was dangerous. James continued. Violations everywhere. Faulty scaffolding, no safety equipment, corners cut to save money. We all knew it, but we needed the keys. My father was a factory safety inspector back then. I know. He was called in to inspect the site, and he didn't just look the other thing, even though the developer offered him money to. He filed a report, detailed, damning, got the project shut down immediately. Grace's breath caught. 3 days later, the scaffolding on the east wing collapsed. If we'd still been working there, 7 guys would have died, including me. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Your father saved my life. He also lost his job. The developer had him blacklisted. He couldn't find work for 2 years. I didn't know that, Grace whispered. He never told us why he lost that job. Because he's a man of integrity. He did the right thing and paid the price without complaint. James glanced at her. I tracked him down years later. After my company took off, tried to thank him, tried to give him money. He refused. Said he was just doing his job. They pulled through tall gates into a sprawling estate. The main house was lit like a palace. I told him if I ever got the chance to help his family, I would, James said. He laughed it off, said his family would be fine, that good people look after each other. He parked in front of a smaller house, tucked behind hedges. Lights glowed warmly through the windows. When I hired Derek Manning 2 years ago, I didn't know he was married to Frank Hartford's daughter. I didn't make the connection until today. How did you know to come to the house? Grace asked. I've been investigating Derek for 3 months. Embezzlement. He's been skimming from company accounts, cooking books, hiding transactions. I had forensic accountants going through everything. James turned off the engine. I came to his house today to fire him and hand over evidence to the police. Instead, I walked in on him trying to kill you all. Grace's hand moved to the bandage on her throat. Your father saved my life once, James said quietly. Today, I got to save his daughters. That's not coincidence, that's debt paid. Tears ran down Grace's face. All this time, she thought no one cared, that she was alone. But her father's integrity, decades old, had reached through time to save her. There's more, James said. The embezzlement investigation has uncovered other things. Derek's business partner, Ryan Wells' boss, is involved. So is someone named Becca Sullivan. There's a pattern of fraud, identity theft, money laundering. The FBI is involved now. Ryan Wells, Grace said slowly. Nora's boyfriend. Your friend? Not anymore. James nodded. I have lawyers, the best. They'll handle everything. The custody case, the criminal trial, all of it. No cost to you. I can't ask you to wish you're at Custonorsken. I'm offering, in honor of your fiduciary, in honor of doing what's right. He opened his door. Come on, let's get you settled. The guest house was beautiful. 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, soft couches and warm lighting. Grace stood in the middle of the living room, overwhelmed. There's food in the fridge, James said. Security codes are on the counter. You're safe here. Gates, cameras, patrol. Nobody gets in without clearance. Thank you, Grace whispered. For everything. James paused at the door. Your father taught me something I've never forgotten. He said, doing right isn't about reward. It's about being able to look yourself in the mirror. I'm just trying to live up to that. When he left, Grace sank onto the couch and let herself cry. For the first time in months, they were tears of relief instead of despair. She called her parents on the landline. Grace, her mother's voice was thick with worry. Where are you? We heard what happened. The police called. I'm safe, Mom. I'm staying somewhere secure. Come home, sweetheart. We'll make room. We'll figure it out. I know, but I'm okay where I am. Mom, did Dad ever tell you about a construction site in Riverside 20 years ago? There was a long pause, Jim. The shopping center project. He lost his job over that. He saved 7 men's lives, including the man who's helping me now. Her mother's voice broke. Your father never talks about it, says he was just doing his job. Tell him, Pogba, and Grace said. that his job is still saving lives, and even now. That night, Grace slept in a real bed, in a locked house with security outside. For the first time in months, she didn't have nightmares. When she woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows. Her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Malcolm Torres, attorney for Mr. Cordell. Meeting today at 2 p.m. We have a strategy. You're not alone anymore. Grace put her hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick. We're going to be okay, she whispered. Your grandpa made sure of it, even before you were born. Outside, birds sang in the trees, and for the first time in a very long time, Grace Hartford smiled. Malcolm Torres had the kind of office that made you believe in justice. Wood-paneled walls, leather-bound law books, and a view of downtown Los Angeles that said he won more cases than he lost. Grace sat across from him, James Cordell beside her. A woman she didn't recognize sat at the end of the conference table, slim and sharp-eyed, with silver hair cut in a precise bob. Mrs. Manning, Malcolm began, this is Isla Grant. She's a commercial developer and, until recently, Derek Manning's competitor. Isla nodded at Grace. Former victim is more accurate. Grace frowned. I don't understand. 6 years ago, Isla said, her voice clipped. I hired Derek Manning as a consultant. We were developing a project in Santa Monica. He was charming, professional, persuasive. He was also stealing. She slid a folder across the table. Property surveys, architectural plans, financial models, everything he learned about my project. He copied and gave to his own company. By the time I realized what was happening, he'd launched a competing development that undercut my pricing and timeline. I lost everything. Grace opened the folder, seeing pages of documents marked confidential and proprietary. I couldn't prove it then. Isla continued. No evidence, no witnesses. He covered his tracks well, but I kept watching, waiting, building a case. Malcolm picked up the thread. When James contacted me about Derek's embezzlement, I reached out to Isla. She's been documenting Derek's business practices for years. And there's more. Derek has a pattern, James said. He targets women. In business and personally, he gains their trust, exploits their resources, then discards them when they're no longer useful. Isla, you were one. Grace, you are another. There's at least 3 more we've identified. Malcolm added, former girlfriends, business associates, even a previous wife he neglected to mention. Grace's head spun. He was married before divorced 6 years ago. She got nothing in the settlement. He claimed bankruptcy, hid assets, and left her with his debts. Malcolm slid another folder across. Her name is Patricia Holmes. She's willing to testify. About what? About his pattern of abuse? About his methods? About how he isolated her, controlled her money, threatened her when she tried to leave. Her testimony establishes a pattern of behavior. Isla leaned forward. But here's the thing. Grace, Derek's smart. He's always been one step ahead of his victims. We have evidence of financial crimes, yes. We have testimony about his character. But what we need is something concrete, something undeniable. The scissors, Grace said quietly. He tried to kill me. He'll claim self-defense, that you attacked first. Malcolm's expression was sympathetic but realistic. His lawyer is already spinning that narrative. Unstable pregnant woman, hormonal, made false accusations, attacked when confronted. But James saw the end of the confrontation, not the beginning. And Derek's lawyer will argue that James's testimony is biased because he's involved in the embezzlement investigation. Grace felt the walls closing in again. So we're back where we started. Not quite, Isla said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice, because Derek's made one crucial mistake. She pulled out her phone and turned it toward Grace. On the screen was a photo of Becca Sullivan. Becca's frightened, Isla said. She's facing serious criminal charges. And unlike Derek, she doesn't have a history of getting away with things. She's never been arrested before. She's terrified. My contact in the DA's office says she's ready to flip, Malcolm added. If we offer her a deal, she'll testify against Derek, provide recordings, text messages, everything. Recordings. Grace's pulse quickened. Becca's been recording conversations with Derek for months. Insurance, she called it. She knew he'd throw her under the bus eventually, so she documented everything. Malcolm smiled grimly. And because she was part of the conversations, those recordings are perfectly legal. James spoke up. The recordings include Derek planning to force you to give birth, then take the baby. They include him admitting to the embezzlement. They include him discussing how to get you committed to a psychiatric facility. Grace's hands started shaking. He wanted to have me committed. He had a doctor lined up, a friend who owed him favors. The plan was to have you declared mentally incompetent after the baby was born. He'd get full custody, and you'd be locked in a facility. The room spun. Grace gripped the edge of the table. But Becca recorded in all of it, Isla said. Every plan, every scheme, every crime. She thought she was protecting herself. Instead, she created the evidence we need to bury him. Malcolm pulled up a document on his laptop and turned it toward Grace. This is Becca's proffer agreement. In exchange for her testimony and evidence, she'll plead guilty to conspiracy and get probation. No jail time. She gets off, Grace's voice rose. She held scissors to my throat. She gets probation and a felony record. Malcolm corrected. Derek gets years in federal prison. We pick our battles, Grace. We want the bigger fish. Grace closed her eyes, breathing hard. Part of her wanted Becca to suffer more, but the rational part knew Malcolm was right. What do I have to do, she asked. Right now, nothing. We handle the legal side. The DA files charges. Becca testifies before the grand jury. Derek gets indicted. Malcolm's smile was predatory. Then we go to trial. How long? 6 months, maybe 8. You'll have the baby before it starts. That's good. Jury will see you as a mother, not just a victim. And custody. With Derek facing multiple felonies, the family court will grant you temporary full custody. After his conviction, it'll be permanent. He'll have no parental rights. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt something like hope. So we just wait. We prepare, James said. Derek will be out on bail. He'll be desperate. Desperate people do stupid things. As if on cue, Malcolm's phone buzzed. He read the text and his expression darkened. Speaking of stupid things, Derek just posted bail. $2 million. He's out. Grace's stomach dropped. He's free. With conditions, restraining order, electronic monitoring. He can't come within 500 feet of you. Malcolm's voice was reassuring, but Grace saw the concern in his eyes. You're safe in James' guest house. Security there is top-notch. But as they left the office building, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She scanned the parking garage nervously. He can't get to you, James said quietly. I promise. Grace wanted to believe him, but she'd learned the hard way that Derek Manning had a talent for finding ways around obstacles. That night, alone in the guest house, Grace couldn't sleep. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow looked like someone approaching. At 2 a.m, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. You think you've won. You haven't? I always win. Enjoy your temporary safety. Grace's hands shook as she forwarded the text to Malcolm. His response came immediately. Screenshotted, sent to DA. That's a restraining order violation. Police are being notified. But the damage was done. Derek was out there, somewhere in the night, thinking about her, planning, waiting. Grace put her hand on her stomach. The baby kicked, strong and insistent. I won't let him hurt you, she whispered. I promise. But as she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she wondered if it was a promise she could keep. 3 months passed in a strange kind of limbo. Grace's stomach grew round and full. The baby kicked constantly now, strong enough that she could see the movements through her shirt. She'd moved back into the guest house on James's property after the text messages stopped, after Derek's electronic monitor kept pinging him at his own address, after Malcolm assured her the restraining order was working. But working and feeling safe were different things. The nursery sat empty at her parents' house in Riverside. Grace had moved there 2 weeks ago, into her childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded posters and yearbooks. Her mother fussed constantly. Her father said little, But Grace would catch him looking at her with an expression that mixed pride and heartbreak. "I should have known," he said one night, sitting on the edge of her bed like she was 12 again. "When I met Derek at the wedding, something felt off. You warned me, Dad. Not hard enough." He patted her hand, his calloused palm rough against her skin. "Your mother and I, we wanted you to make your own choices, but I should have pushed harder. You taught me right from wrong. That's all any parent can do." Grace thought of James Cordell, of the construction site 20 years ago. "You did more than you know." The baby was due in 6 weeks. The custody hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after that. But first came Derek's deposition. Malcolm called her the night before. "Tomorrow is crucial. Derek's deposition is being recorded. Everything he says is under oath. His lawyer will try to coach him, but we'll catch him in contradictions." "Will I have to be there?" "No, just Derek, his lawyer, me, and the court reporter. But Grace, I need you ready for your deposition next week. His lawyer will come after you hard. He'll try to make you seem unstable, emotional, vindictive." "I am emotional. I'm 7 months pregnant." Malcolm's voice softened. "And that's what makes you credible. Don't hide it, but don't let him bait you into anger. Stay calm. Tell the truth. Let your truth be stronger than his lies." Derek's deposition lasted 6 hours. Malcolm called her afterward, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "He fell apart, completely. We have everything we need." "What happened?" "He started confident, charming, even, denied the affair, claimed Becca was just a friend, said you were paranoid and hormonal." Malcolm chuckled darkly. "Then I played the recordings." Grace's breath caught. "Becca's recordings, every single one. Derek planning to take your baby, Derek discussing embezzlement, Derek laughing about having you committed. His face when he realized we had all of it. Grace, I wish you could have seen it." "What did he say?" "He tried to deny it was his voice." His lawyer objected. "But the recordings are authenticated. Voice analysis, metadata, everything." Then Derek started contradicting himself, claiming he was joking, that it was taken out of context. By the end, he was shouting. His lawyer had to call recess 3 times. And then, Malcolm's voice turned grim. Then someone leaked it. Leaked what? The deposition video, all 6 hours. It's online, everywhere. YouTube, Twitter, TikTok. Millions of views already. Grace's stomach lurched. "How, William?" "We're investigating. But Grace, you need to see this. Not the whole thing. Just the reactions. The public is on your side. Completely." That night, Grace sat with her parents and watched clips of Derek's deposition on her laptop. The comment section scrolled past, thousands of people expressing outrage, sympathy, disgust. That man belongs in prison. How could he do that to his pregnant wife? I hope she gets everything. This is why women don't report abuse. News outlets picked up the story. Grace's phone exploded with interview requests, which Malcolm's office screened. By morning, Derek Manning's face was everywhere, viral for all the wrong reasons. Derek's business partners issued statements distancing themselves. His few remaining clients dropped him. The judge in the criminal case raised his bail and tightened his restrictions. But the viral video had another effect Grace didn't anticipate. Women started reaching out. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Women who'd experienced similar abuse. Women who'd been trapped, isolated, threatened. Women who'd escaped, and women who were still surviving. They sent messages through Malcolm's office, through social media, through every channel they could find. "Your courage gave me strength to leave. I thought I was alone. You showed me I'm not. Thank you for speaking up." Grace read them late at night, crying over each one. She'd been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't realized how many others were fighting the same battle. "You should respond," her mother said gently. "Not to all of them, but to some." Grace started writing. Short messages at first, then longer ones. Sharing resources, offering hope, building connections. By the time her deposition came the following week, Grace wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. Derek's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Richard Crane, sat across from her in the conference room with undisguised hostility. Mrs. Manning, he began, his voice dripping with disdain. You claim to have been abused by my client, yet you stayed for 3 years. Wait, by Grace met his eyes because I was afraid, because he controlled our money, because he isolated me from my family and friends, because abuse doesn't look like a bomb when you're in the middle of it. But you never called the police. No, never filed a report. Not until he put scissors to my throat. You claim he had an affair with Miss Sullivan, but you have no concrete proof prior to the recordings, correct? I saw them together. I found hotel reservations. I knew. Crane leaned forward. You knew, or you suspected. Isn't it true that you've struggled with paranoia during your pregnancy? Malcolm started to object, but Grace held up her hand. I struggled with the reality that my husband was sleeping with another woman while I was carrying his child. If that's paranoia, then yes, I was paranoid. You illegally recorded conversations. Once, and I deleted it immediately when I learned it was illegal. But the impulse to spy on your husband, to secretly record him, that suggests a level of distrust that borders on obsession. Grace's hands clenched under the table. She took a breath, remembering Malcolm's advice. Stay calm. My distrust was justified. The recordings Ms. Sullivan made, legally, proved everything I suspected was true. Crane shifted tactics. Your best friend, Nora Price, has stated that you seemed unstable, that you made wild accusations, that you appeared to be having a mental health crisis. Nora was dating my husband's business partner. She chose their side. Or she chose reality. Isn't it possible that you fabricated this entire narrative because you were unhappy in your marriage? No. That you're using your pregnancy as a weapon to gain sympathy. Grace's voice hardened. I'm using my voice to tell the truth. Something your client tried to take from me with scissors. The deposition lasted 4 hours. Crane attacked from every angle. Grace's credibility, her mental state, her motives, her memory. But she held firm, answering each question with steady honesty. When it ended, Malcolm squeezed her shoulder. You were perfect. I don't feel perfect. I feel exhausted. That's because you just fought a 4-hour battle and won. Go home. Rest. The hard part is over. But Malcolm was wrong. The hard part was just beginning. Because that night, as Grace lay in bed at her parents' house, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking Derek Manning's assets frozen in federal embezzlement case. She read the article with growing dread. Derek had lost everything. His company, his house, his bank accounts, his reputation, everything, and desperate people. Grace knew, were the most dangerous kind. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. You destroyed my life. I'll destroy yours. Grace forwarded it to Malcolm, to the police, to everyone who could help. But as she lay in the dark, feeling her baby kick inside her, she knew that electronic monitors and restraining orders were just paper and plastic. If Derek wanted to hurt her, he'd find a way. The only question was, when? Grace's water broke at 3 in the morning, 6 days before her due date. She woke to wetness and cramping, her body announcing that, ready or not, this baby was coming. Mom, she called out, her voice sharp with surprise and fear. Ruth Hartford appeared in seconds, her gray hair in curlers, her face instantly alert. It's time, name. The next hour was controlled chaos. Ruth woke Frank, who fumbled with car keys while Grace breathed through contractions in the hallway. They called Malcolm, who immediately activated security protocols. They called James, who dispatched his personal security team to meet them at the hospital. By the time they arrived at Riverside Community Hospital, Grace's contractions were 4 minutes apart. The security team was already positioned at the entrance, checking IDs, monitoring exits. Is all this necessary? Ruth whispered to Malcolm, who'd arrived 20 minutes after them. Derek violated the restraining order twice last week, drove past the house, sent threatening messages from burner phones. Malcolm's expression was grim. We're not taking pens. Labor progressed fast, too fast. The nurses said, for a first baby. Grace gripped her mother's hand through waves of pain, breathing through contractions that felt like her body was being torn apart. You're doing great, sweetheart, Ruth murmured, wiping sweat from Grace's forehead. Frank stood in the corner, uncomfortable in the delivery room but refusing to leave. His presence steadied Grace more than he knew. "Dad," she gasped between contractions. "If something happens to me, nothing's happening to you, Givoy," he said firmly. "You're strong, like your mother, like your grandmother. Hartford women don't give up." At 7:43 in the morning, after 4 hours of labor, Grace's son entered the world, 6 pounds, 9 ounces. Perfect, beautiful, screaming with healthy lungs. The nurse placed him on Grace's chest, and the world narrowed to just the two of them. His tiny fingers, his dark hair, his eyes, unfocused but searching. "Hi," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mom. I've been waiting for you." She named him Frank, after her father, Franklin James Hartford. Not Manning, never Manning. Her father wept openly when she told him. Ruth took approximately 7,000 photos. The baby nursed, Grace slept, and for a few hours, everything was perfect. Then Malcolm appeared in the doorway, his expression tight. "Grace, we need to talk." She was instantly alert. "What happened?" "Derek knows about the baby. He's demanding to see him." "How did he?" "Social media. Your mother posted a photo, just of the baby, not you. But Derek saw it. His lawyer filed an emergency motion claiming parental rights." Grace's arms tightened around Frank. "No. The judge denied it, for now. But there will be a hearing next week. Derek's lawyer is arguing that regardless of the criminal charges, he still has rights as the biological father. He tried to kill me. He threatened to take my baby." "I know. And we have evidence of that. But the law is complicated. Family court and criminal court are separate systems." Malcolm sat in the chair beside her bed. "We'll fight this. We'll win. But I need you prepared for the possibility that Derek might get supervised visitation eventually." Grace looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms. "Over my dead body." "Don't say that," Ruth whispered. "Don't even joke." "I'm not joking. Mom, he's never touching this baby. Never." Over the next 3 days in the hospital, security remained tight. Grace's room number was kept confidential. Visitors were screened. Nurses were briefed about the situation. On the second day, a man tried to enter the maternity ward claiming to be Grace's brother. Security stopped him. He matched Derek's height and build, though his face was obscured by a surgical mask and hat. "I'm here to see my sister," he insisted. "Mrs. Hartford doesn't have a brother," the security guard said. The man argued for 5 minutes before leaving. The hospital reviewed security footage, but the angle was wrong. The lighting poor. They couldn't confirm it was Derek. But Grace knew. She felt it in her gut. On the third day, they went home to her parents' house. James's security team swept the property first, checked doors and windows, installed additional cameras. "You're safe here at my moment," James said, appearing that afternoon with gifts. A car seat, a designer diaper bag, a college savings bond. "And when you're ready, the guest house is yours for as long as you need." "Thank you," Grace said, meaning it. "For everything." James held baby Frank carefully, awkwardly, like he might break. "Your grandfather saved my life once," he told the sleeping infant. "I guess that makes you and me even now." That night, Grace lay in her childhood bed with Frank in a bassinet beside her. She listened to him breathe, tiny snuffling sounds that made her heart hurt with love. Her phone buzzed. Malcolm, hearing scheduled for Thursday. Be ready. 4 days. 4 days until she had to face Derek in court. 4 days until a judge decided whether the man who'd held scissors to her throat would get access to her son. Grace looked at Frank, his small face peaceful in sleep. "I won't let him hurt you," she whispered. "Whatever it takes." Outside, a car drove slowly past the house. Too slowly. Grace heard it pause, heard an engine idling. Then it drove away. Grace didn't sleep that night. She just watched her baby breathe and waited for Thursday to come. The courtroom was smaller than Grace expected. Family court, not criminal. No jury, just a judge. Judge Rebecca Morrison. A woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Derek sat across the aisle with Richard Crane. He'd lost weight, his suit hung loose, and his face looked gaunt. But when he saw Grace, his expression hardened into something cold and predatory. Grace held baby Frank against her shoulder, feeling his warmth through her blouse. Malcolm sat beside her. James was in the gallery, along with Grace's parents. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Morrison entered, her black robe swishing. She sat, adjusted her glasses, and reviewed the file before her. "This is a hearing regarding temporary custody arrangements in the matter of Manning versus Manning." She looked up. "I've reviewed the circumstances. This is unusual, given the pending criminal trial, but Mr. Manning has a constitutional right to petition for parental access. So here we are." Richard Crane stood. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges the criminal allegations. However, he maintains his innocence and expects to be exonerated. In the meantime, he's being denied access to his biological child. This is a violation of his fundamental rights as a father." Judge Morrison's expression was skeptical. "Mr. Crane, your client is accused of threatening his pregnant wife with deadly weapons. There is video evidence, witness testimony, and recorded admissions. Are you seriously arguing he should have unsupervised access to an infant?" "Supervised access, Your Honor, with a neutral third party present. My client simply wants to meet his son." Malcolm stood. "Your Honor, Grace Hartford has a restraining order against Mr. Manning due to his violent threats. He's violated that order multiple times. Just days ago, someone matching his description attempted to enter the hospital maternity ward using false pretenses. We have no proof that was my client," Crane objected. "Because the footage was conveniently obscured." Malcolm's voice was sharp. "But the pattern is clear. Derek Manning has repeatedly demonstrated that he views Grace and the baby not as people, but as possessions he's entitled to control." Judge Morrison held up her hand. "I've read the depositions. I've read the police reports. I've reviewed the recordings Ms. Sullivan provided." She looked at Derek. "Mr. Manning, stand up." Derek rose, his jaw tight. "Did you or did you not threaten to take this child from his mother after birth?" "I was upset. I said things I didn't mean to go away." "Oh. Did you or did you not hold scissors to Grace Manning's throat?" "She attacked us first. I was defending myself." "Mr. Cordell's witness statement contradicts that. He saw you advancing on her with weapons." Judge Morrison's voice was ice. "Did you or did you not plan to have Grace Manning committed to a psychiatric facility?" Derek's face flushed. "That's taken out of context. It's on tape." "Your voice! Your plan!" The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Manning, I've seen a lot of custody disputes. This isn't one, but, this is a criminal case bleeding into family court, and I won't allow you to weaponize your parental rights to continue abusing your victim." "Your Honor," Crane began. "I'm not finished." Judge Morrison turned to Grace. "Mrs. Manning, I see you've followed to change the baby's last name to Hartford." "Yes, Your Honor." "Approved. Effective immediately. Franklin James Hartford." Derek shot to his feet. "You can't." "Sit down, Miss Manning." The judge's voice cracked like a whip. "As for custody, I'm granting sole legal and physical custody to Grace Hartford, with no visitation for Derek Manning pending the outcome of the criminal trial." Crane objected loudly. "Your Honor, that's a constitutional violation. The Constitution doesn't protect violent criminals from the consequences of their actions." Judge Morrison signed an order with a flourish. "If Mr. Manning is acquitted of all charges, he may petition this court again. Until then, he has zero rights to this child." Derek's face went purple with rage. "That's my son. That's a baby who needs protection from you." Judge Morrison stood. "This hearing is adjourned." The bailiff moved toward Derek as his shouting continued. Grace clutched Frank tighter, her heart pounding. "You'll regret this," Derek screamed at her across the courtroom. "All of you, you've destroyed me, and Manning, one more word, and you're in contempt." Judge Morrison's voice cut through his rage. "Bailiff, escort him out." As Derek was led away, still shouting, Grace felt her father's hand on her shoulder. "It's over," Frank Hartford said quietly. "For now, at least." But Malcolm's expression was troubled. "The criminal trial starts in 2 months. That's when it really ends." Outside the courthouse, Grace breathed fresh air for the first time in hours. Frank stirred against her shoulder. making the soft sounds of a baby about to wake. Reporters waited beyond the security perimeter, shouting questions Grace didn't answer. James's car pulled up, and they got in quickly. "That was a good ruling," James said as they drove away. Judge Morrison saw through Derek completely. "Until the trial, Grace said quietly. "If he's acquitted, he won't be." Malcolm's voice was confident. "Becca's testimony is solid. The evidence is overwhelming. We've got this." But Grace couldn't shake the image of Derek's face in the courtroom. The rage, the hatred, the promise of revenge in his eyes. That night, safe in her parents' house with Frank sleeping beside her, Grace finally let herself cry. Not from fear or sadness, but from the sheer exhaustion of fighting for so long. Her mother found her. "Sweetheart, I'm okay. Mom, just tired." "You're more than okay. You're extraordinary." Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. "Your father and we've watched you transform from someone who was broken into someone who's unbreakable." "I don't feel unbreakable. That's what makes you strong. You keep going anyway." Grace looked at her sleeping son. "I have to. For him. And for you. Don't forget that." Ruth kissed her forehead. "Now get some sleep. You've got a baby to raise and a trial to win." Over the next 8 weeks, Grace fell into a rhythm. Wake up with Frank. Feed him. Change him. Love him. Prepare for trial. Malcolm coached her on testimony. Becca's recordings would be played in court. Grace would have to relive the scissors scene, the threats, all of it, in front of a jury, in front of Derek. "I can do this," she told Malcolm during a prep session. "I know you can. But Grace, I need you to understand something. Derek's lawyer will try to destroy you on the stand. He'll bring up every mistake, every moment of weakness, every time you stayed when you should have left. Let him. The truth is stronger than his lies." And she believed it. Because she'd lived through hell and come out the other side. Because she held her son every night and knew exactly what she was fighting for. Because she was Grace Hartford. And Grace Hartford didn't break. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented a case so comprehensive, so damning, that even Derek's expensive lawyers couldn't punch holes in it. Becca Sullivan testified for 2 days. She played the recordings, her voice shaking as she admitted her role in the conspiracy. "He said we'd be together," she said on the stand. "That once Grace was out of the picture, we'd have everything. But he was using me, just like he used her." James Cordell testified about what he'd witnessed. The scissors, the blood, the terror on Grace's face. Patricia Holmes, Derek's first wife, testified about his pattern of abuse. 2 other women came forward with similar stories. The forensic accountant explained the embezzlement in detail. Millions stolen over 2 years, hidden in shell companies and offshore accounts. Grace testified on the final day. She wore a simple navy dress. She spoke clearly, calmly, honestly. When Crane cross-examined her, trying to paint her as vindictive, she held firm. "I'm not here for revenge," she said. "I'm here for justice. There's a difference." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy, embezzlement, endangerment. The list went on. Derek's face crumbled as the verdicts were read. The judge sentenced him 3 weeks later, 8 years federal prison. No parole. Grace watched from the gallery, holding baby Frank, now 3 months old. She felt no triumph, just a quiet sense of closure. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. This time, Grace stopped to speak. "I'm not a hero," she said, her voice steady. "I'm a survivor. And I'm standing here today because people helped me when I needed it most. My parents, James Cordell, Malcolm Torres, even Becca Sullivan, who made terrible choices but ultimately chose truth." She looked into the cameras. "If you're in an abusive relationship, you're not alone. If you think you have no way out, you're wrong. There are people who will help. Organizations that will believe you. A system that, when it works right, will protect you." "What's next for you?" a reporter called out. Grace looked down at Frank, who was trying to grab her necklace. "What's next is raising my son, building a life, and using my voice to help others find theirs." 6 months later, Grace stood in front of a room full of women at a domestic violence conference. She wore professional clothes now, her posture confident, her voice clear. Silence protects abusers, she told them. Speaking up protects victims, and healing isn't linear. Some days I'm strong, some days I'm terrified. But every day, I'm free. She touched the small scar on her throat. He tried to silence me with scissors. Instead, he gave me a voice that can't be cut. The applause was thunderous. After her speech, women lined up to talk to her, to share their stories, to ask for advice. Grace listened to each one, offering resources, hope, connection. James Cordell had funded her nonprofit, Voices for Survivors. It provided legal aid, safe housing, and counseling for women escaping abuse. In 6 months, they'd helped 83 women leave dangerous situations. Grace's life had changed in ways she never imagined. She lived in James's guest house, not as charity, but as a friend. They had dinner together sometimes, took walks with Frank, talked about business, life, the future. "I'm not ready for anything romantic," Grace told him one evening. "Maybe not for a long time." "I'm not asking," James said gently. "I'm just here, as long as you need," and maybe that was enough for now. Grace's parents visited every weekend. Frank was crawling now, getting into everything. Ruth taught him nursery rhymes. Frank built him toy cars. They were happy. Nora Price sent a letter, a long, apologetic letter explaining she'd been manipulated, that she was sorry, that she hoped for forgiveness someday. Grace read it once and filed it away. Maybe someday she'd respond. Maybe not. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. 1 year after the scissors scene, Grace stood in her bathroom, getting ready for another speaking engagement. She looked at herself in the mirror. Not the broken woman from before, not a victim, just Grace, survivor, mother, advocate, human. Her phone buzzed at wow. "Malcolm, Derek's appeal was denied. It's officially over." Grace smiled, not with vindictiveness, but with relief. It was over. The nightmare had ended. The story had closed, but her life was just beginning. She picked up Frank, who giggled and grabbed her nose. "Come on, buddy. We've got work to do." Because there were other women out there, trapped like she'd been, silent like she'd been, frightened like she'd been. And Grace Hartford knew exactly how to help them find their voice. She'd found hers with scissors at her throat. Now she'd use it to make sure no one else had to.